When another wrestler decides he's going to decide who wins is bullshit.
Why do you think he did that?
He's a motherfucker. There's no other way you can say it. He's a piece of shit.
In April 2022, the WWE Hall of Fame opened its doors for two men who had already proven themselves on a very different kind of map. Scott Steiner and his brother Rick walked out to a standing ovation. The crowd was loud. The moment was real. The Steiner brothers were being recognized as one of the greatest tag teams in wrestling history. Scott stood there as a three-time world champion, as an NCAA Division I All-American, as a legitimate athlete who had brought something genuinely dangerous to a world that desperately needed it. He deserved those cheers. Every single one of them. If you are watching this right now and you love these deep dives into wrestling history, go ahead and use the hype feature to give this video some hype. It helps more fans find stories like this one. So hit that button now and let us get straight into it. Back to Scott Steiner, because here is what nobody said out loud on that Hall of Fame stage. The same man being celebrated that night is also the man who spent decades publicly destroying his colleagues. He called them fat. He called them senile. He called them puny, weak, fake, protected, and scared. He did not keep these thoughts private. He put them on live national television. He put them in interviews. He put them in parking lots. And sometimes he made those views physical. The industry absorbed all of it because it had no choice. Today we are going to break down all 10 wrestlers that Scott Steiner has publicly called the weakest. We are starting at number 10 and going all the way down to number 1. We will look at what he said, what he claimed was weak, and what the truth really tells us. Because when Scott Steiner calls someone weak, that word reveals far more about him than it does about the person he is targeting. And that is exactly where the real story begins. To understand Scott Steiner's obsession with weakness, you have to understand where his standard came from. Not the character, not the promos, the actual man behind all of it. Scott Rex Steiner competed at the University of Michigan in the 1980s. He wrestled in the 190-pound weight class in the Big Ten Conference, one of the most demanding collegiate arenas in American sport. He was not a casual participant. He was a three-time Big Ten finalist. He finished his career with 125 wins, 51 losses, and 2 draws. In his final year, he earned NCAA Division I All-American status, finishing 6th nationally. These are not soft numbers. These are the results of a man who had to earn every single point on the mat under real conditions with no script to protect him. That background gave Steiner a measuring stick he never put down. In his mind, there were two kinds of people in any wrestling locker room. There were real athletes, people with legitimate combat training who could back up their reputation in an unscripted situation, and then there were workers. Workers were men who existed only because a promoter had decided to keep them alive. Workers could not survive a real contest. They survived because the system protected them, and that protection to Steiner was an act of dishonesty. To Steiner, a real wrestler had to pass 2 tests. The first was the peaks, his word for the biceps, the physical proof that you had built a body worthy of the ring. What if your physique did not reflect genuine work and dominance? You were a fraud, a pretender, someone occupying a position that belonged to a real athlete. The second test was the fight, not a scripted match with a predetermined finish. A real, unscripted physical confrontation with no referee and no protection. Could you handle that? If the answer was no, you were weak, full stop. And in Scott Steiner's world, weakness was not simply a physical condition. It was a moral failure. A weak man was not just unable. He was dishonest. He was pretending to be something he was not. He was using a system designed to protect the unworthy in order to stay somewhere he did not deserve. When Steiner called someone weak, he was not critiquing their performance. He was accusing them of fraud. He was telling them they were a liar. That is a different kind of attack. It cuts deeper than any promo because it is personal at the deepest level. There is a version of this worldview that contains a legitimate point. The wrestling industry has always had performers who reach the top through political connections rather than genuine ability. Steiner was perceptive about that. He watched men with limited athletic gifts succeed because they had the right relationships with the right people in power. He saw the industry shift further and further from legitimate athletic competition toward scripted entertainment. His frustration was real, and it was rooted in something true. But the problem was never the diagnosis. The problem was the treatment. Steiner did not simply observe weakness and feel disappointed. He turned his standard into a weapon. He used it to publicly humiliate colleagues on national television. He used it to justify aggression that went far beyond any reasonable critique. He took real insights about a broken industry and transformed them into personal demolition campaigns against individual human beings who shared a locker room with him. The cruelty was not incidental. The cruelty was the point. His brother Rick shared the same foundation. Together, they became the Steiner Brothers and brought something different to professional wrestling. Stiffness, physical reality. When they hit you, you knew about it. Jim Crockett Promotions and World Championship Wrestling built around that credibility because audiences could feel the difference between a team that was performing and a team that was actually dangerous. That credibility became Scott's entire identity. When the industry moved away from it, he felt the shift as a personal betrayal. He also believed that physical innovation separated the real from the fake, and in this area, he was genuinely exceptional. In his prime, Scott Steiner was arguably the most athletic heavyweight in the world. The Frankensteiner was a leaping head scissors takedown from a man of his size and mass. It should not have been physically possible. It won him the Best Maneuver Award in both 1989 and 1990. The Steiner screwdriver was a vertical suplex transitioned into a pile driver. Dangerous, precise. Only a trained athlete could apply it without hospitalizing someone. The Steiner recliner was raw power made visible. And the SSD, the Steiner driver, was another vertical suplex pile driver that solidified his reputation for high-impact dominance. He had real talent. That is simply true. The Frankensteiner alone would have secured his legacy. His amateur credentials were real. His physical ability was extraordinary. And here is what made the rage so loud. A man of genuine ability does not need to bully people. His record speaks for itself. But Steiner could not see it that way because the rage was never about proving he was good. The rage was about the fact that the system was not organized around his standard, and that felt like injustice that required loud public correction. By 1998, the transformation into Big Papa Pump was complete. The singlet was gone. The mullet was gone. What replaced them was a physique that defied what people expected a human body to look like. Bleached hair, chainmail headgear, and a persona that was not really a character at all. It was Steiner with every filter removed. The contempt was louder. The standard was enforced with more aggression than ever before. He began taking live microphones and saying things that had never been written by a producer. He aired real grievances in real time. He called people out by name on national television. The people running the broadcast could not stop him. The wrestlers in the locker room knew better than to try. He was too physically dangerous and too genuinely volatile to control through normal channels. The machine had produced a loose cannon. Now it had to live with the consequences. The story of Scott Steiner is a story of two halves. The first half is the legitimate athlete who brought something rare into professional wrestling. The second half is the man that athlete became when the world refused to reorganize itself around his values. His early professional career, formed through Jim Crockett Promotions and then World Championship Wrestling, was built on the same foundation as his amateur years. The Steiners hit harder than other teams. They moved faster. They were more physically credible, and they were genuinely threatening in a way that few tag teams of any era have been. His singles career showed that his talent extended beyond the team format. He challenged Ric Flair for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship on January 30th, 1991 at Clash of the Champions 14. The match went the full 60 minutes and ended in a draw. Steiner felt he had been deliberately held back by Flair, who he believed used his experience and political standing to make Steiner look less ready than he actually was. This was the seed of a hatred that would bloom into one of the most infamous shoot promos in wrestling history. Through the 1990s, the wrestling industry was changing rapidly. The shift towards sports entertainment was well underway. More story, more script, more characters designed to entertain rather than to physically dominate. For most wrestlers, this was simply how the business worked. For Scott Steiner, it was an ongoing insult to everything he stood for. His return to WWE between 2002 and 2004 made the clash explicit. WWE wanted a traditional babyface. They got the genetic freak. The two things were completely incompatible. They toned down his promos. They scripted his movements. And they placed him in a feud with Triple H for the World Heavyweight Championship and surrounded it with entertainment segments that had nothing to do with Steiner's actual identity as a performer. He was in the machine. The machine was swallowing him, and he could feel every single moment of it. His time in TNA gave him a fresh stage and new targets. He delivered the Steiner math promo. He attacked colleagues. He applied the same standard to a new room and found the same failures everywhere he looked. The pattern never changed. The man never changed. A different company, a different roster, the same genetic freak carrying the same measuring stick and finding the same weakness everywhere he pointed it. That consistency is either a mark of integrity or a mark of obsession. Depending on who you ask, it is probably both. And the tragedy of Scott Steiner is not that he was wrong about the industry. The tragedy is that he could not separate the legitimate criticism from the personal cruelty. He could see the machine clearly. He understood exactly how it worked and who it was designed to protect. But every time he opened his mouth to say so, what came out was not reform. It was punishment. Targeted personal punishment movement of people who were simply trying to do their jobs in the same broken system he had inherited. Now let us talk about the 10 wrestlers he put on that list. Starting at number 10 and going all the way down to number 1, these are Scott Steiner's weakest picks, and this is what those picks say about the man who made them. Number 10, Ric Flair. Ric Flair is one of the most decorated figures in professional wrestling history. 16 world title reigns, a career spanning multiple decades, a style that influenced almost every top performer who came after him. Fans celebrated him as the standard of excellence. Scott Steiner saw something completely different. The heat between these two men started on January 30th, 1991, at Clash of the Champions 14. Steiner challenged Flair for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. The match went the full 60 minutes and ended in a time limit draw. From the outside, it looked competitive. From Steiner's perspective, it was a political act. He believed Flair had deliberately sandbagged him, working just poorly enough to prevent Steiner from genuinely breaking through as a main event threat. A man afraid of a real athlete's potential, using his political standing to smother it. That belief burned for years. Then, or now, on February 7th, 2000, it exploded on live television. At a WCW Monday Nitro broadcast in Tulsa, Steiner was handed a microphone and he walked straight off the script. He buried Ric Flair in front of the national audience. He told the crowd that Flair had stolen the Nature Boy gimmick from Buddy Rogers. He mocked Flair's aging physique, comparing his skin to a Shar-Pei puppy. He insulted Flair's teeth. He said Flair was the reason WCW was losing to the WWF and that fans should turn the channel and watch Stone Cold Steve Austin instead. He said Flair's career was dead. Steiner received a 2-week suspension. He reportedly lost no pay. The company could not truly punish him. They needed him too much. And from Steiner's perspective, nothing he said was wrong. Flair was protected by management and sugar-coated by legacy. A genetic freak had to fight for every inch of respect. An aging star like Flair just had to show up. That imbalance was, to Scott Steiner, the clearest proof of weakness in the entire industry. The reality is that Ric Flair built a template for in-ring psychology that shaped generations. He worked a style that demanded a level of communication and timing that very few performers have ever matched. He did not hold his position through nothing. He held it because he was genuinely exceptional at his craft. But to Steiner, craft was not the measure. It was never the measure. The peaks mattered. The fight mattered. Legacy was not a defense. It was an excuse. And Steiner had no interest in making excuses for anyone who could not pass the 2 tests that, in his mind, defined what a real wrestler actually was. Number 9, Diamond Dallas Page. Diamond Dallas Page reached the top of professional wrestling through sheer willpower. He started late in the business. He worked relentlessly. He developed real charisma. He became a WCW main event star, largely through self-belief and effort, rather than a lifetime of athletic training. He was not an amateur wrestler. He was not a lifelong combat athlete. And to Scott Steiner, that made his position in WCW a problem that needed addressing. The conflict started with a locker room situation in late 2000. DDP's wife, Kimberly Page, reportedly discovered drug paraphernalia belonging to Tammy Sitch, known as Sunny, and alerted management. Steiner viewed Kimberly's action as that of a rat, someone breaking the unspoken code of the locker room by going to management with internal matters. His response was extreme by any measure. When he bullied Kimberly to the point where she reportedly fled the arena in fear, then he took the grievance to live television and delivered a promo suggesting DDP should have a sex change if he wanted the courage to face him directly. When Steiner returned backstage, DDP confronted him. It became a real fight. Witness accounts described it as one-sided. Steiner broke free from people trying to separate them and attacked DDP again, going directly for his eyes. His filed fingernails reportedly came close to costing DDP his vision. DDP emerged with facial scratches. Steiner was described by those present as a genuine terror. To Steiner, DDP's position in WCW was tied to his friendship with Eric Bischoff rather than any ability to defend himself against a real athlete. The fight was his way of proving that. He called it policing the locker room. What it actually was is harder to defend. A man of significant physical training using those skills to cause genuine harm to a colleague, then constructing a philosophy around it to make it sound like justice. The people who witnessed it were not watching justice being served. They were watching someone cross a line that an amateur record and a legitimate grievance do not give you the right to cross. That is not a standard. That is a rationalization. Number 8, Triple H. If DDP represented the company man who had worked his way up through effort and politics, Triple H represented something more threatening to Steiner. He represented the machine itself. A man who had married into power and used that power to shape the industry around his own career at the expense of everyone else. Steiner's 2002 to 2004 WWE run was one of the most anticipated comebacks of that era. It became one of the most disappointing. WWE wanted a traditional babyface, Yes, they got the genetic freak. The two things were entirely incompatible. They neutered his promos. They scripted his segments. They built his feud with Triple H, the world heavyweight champion, around push-up contests and arm wrestling. Steiner treated these segments as genuine opportunities to demonstrate that Triple H was a weak imitation of real physical dominance. When WWE management reportedly asked Steiner to submit to drug testing, he responded by saying he would, but only if Triple H was tested at the same time. He told them Triple H should pick him up in the limo and they could go get tested together. That shut the conversation down. To Steiner, but it was proof that the company applied different standards to different people depending on their political value, a system that protected its chosen people while scrutinizing everyone else. The Royal Rumble 2003 match became one of the worst title matches in the event's history. Steiner was dealing with drop foot syndrome, nerve damage carried from his WCW days. Triple H was recovering from a torn quad. Steiner gassed out within minutes. He performed over a dozen belly-to-belly suplexes because his body had run out of options. Triple H was accused of sandbagging the suplexes, refusing to take their full impact. The match ended in disqualification, with Triple H retaining the title. In Steiner's mind, the weak man had used the rules to survive a real athlete. The machine had done exactly what the machine always does. It protected its chosen people and left the legitimate athlete holding nothing. The pose-down segments, the drug test standoff, the catastrophic match, all of it confirmed to Steiner what he already believed. The system was rigged. The system favored the political. And no matter how much of a genetic freak you were, the system would find a way to make sure the right man left with the belt. It had nothing to do with who was stronger. It had everything to do with who had power behind them. Number 7, Test. Test was a big man, tall, physically imposing, carrying the kind of size that should have registered at least partially on Steiner's measuring scale. He had genuine physical presence, but Steiner's contempt for him was consistent and public throughout their time together in WWE. When the interaction came through one of the stranger storylines of the 2003 period. Steiner and Test were placed in a feud over the managerial services of Stacy Keibler. The angle required Steiner to engage with scripted romance and dramatic beats. He had approximately zero interest in any of it. He showed up. He did the segments. He treated the whole exercise with the enthusiasm of a man being asked to perform a task far beneath him. His assessment of Test was direct. A gassed-out rookie, weak in the head and weak in the ring. Someone unable to handle the physical intensity that Big Papa Pump brought to every match. Test in Steiner's hierarchy was mid-card talent placed in a main event storyline because the company needed bodies to fill the card. Steiner famously turned on Stacy Keibler partway through the angle with no clear scripted reason. Some observers read this as Steiner simply refusing to follow the entertainment beats the writers had designed for him. He was not going to perform a romance angle. He was not going to pretend the storyline reflected anything real. He walked away from the script mid-angle and left everyone else to figure out how to respond. The cruelty here is straightforward. Test was by most accounts a genuine professional working hard within a system that did not always give him the best material. Steiner's dismissal of him was not considered criticism. It was a snap judgment delivered publicly. The standard was applied. Test did not meet it. Case closed. No further discussion required. Number 6, Samoa Joe. This is the entry that became a cultural moment, not because of anything that happened in a match, because of mathematics. On May 1st, 2008, on a live episode of TNA Impact, Scott Steiner delivered what became known as the Steiner Math promo. It was a piece of unintentional performance art, and underneath the absurdity was the clearest, most condensed expression of everything Steiner believed about physical weakness and the certainty of his own superiority. The context was a three-way match at the TNA pay-per-view sacrifice between Steiner, Samoa Joe, and Kurt Angle. Steiner walked to the ring and explained, using the language of mathematics, that Samoa Joe had no chance of winning. In a standard match, he explained, everyone has a 50% chance, but because Steiner is a genetic freak who is not normal, his odds go up. Because Joe's physical condition makes victory an impossibility, his odds go drastically down. Kurt Angle, Steiner argued, knew he could not beat a genetic freak and would not even try. Therefore, the match was effectively between Steiner and Joe alone. And the numbers did not lie. He called Joe fat. He called him out of shape. He said Joe did not have the muscle to remain in the same ring as Big Papa Pump. He reduced an entire career to a body composition calculation and presented that calculation as settled science. He was certain. He was committed. He was completely wrong about the result. Samoa Joe won the match. The numbers spelled disaster for Steiner, not Joe. But here is the strange truth. The promo outlasted the result. People still quote Steiner math. The actual match outcome has largely been forgotten. So Steiner's verbal assault became the dominant narrative of the feud, which tells you exactly how effective he was at defining his opponents regardless of what happened in the ring. The cruelty is that Samoa Joe was an exceptional performer by any honest measure. He was athletic, technically skilled and genuinely dangerous in his own right. He connected with audiences across multiple companies for years, but Steiner did not care about any of that. He cared about the peaks. He cared about the physique that could be seen and measured and judged. Joe failed that specific visual test, and once Steiner had decided someone had failed, the verdict was permanent. The room was informed. No championship result was going to change any part of it. Number 5, Abyss. If Samoa Joe gave Steiner a mathematical target, Abyss gave him something simpler, much of a visual. A large man in a mask performing a character built on chaos and spectacle rather than technical wrestling. To Scott Steiner, almost everything about Abyss was wrong. Abyss was a TNA fixture. He was well over 6 feet tall, carried significant mass, and worked a monster character that leaned heavily on weapons and physical destruction. For a broad wrestling audience, he was effective and imposing. He created memorable moments. For Scott Steiner, he was a fat man hiding behind a mask. That was close to a direct description. Steiner looked at Abyss and saw someone using a costume and a gimmick to conceal the absence of what Steiner valued most. The mask was not a creative character choice. To Steiner, it was cover. It hid the lack of peaks. It hid the absence of a physique that reflected genuine physical work. It was a prop used by a man who could not pass the genetic freak test. His verbal attack on Abyss was characteristic. He called him a joke, a fat guy in a mask who thought a costume made him a threat. He told Abyss that what was actually scary was the Steiner recliner. He promised to demonstrate publicly and without apology what a real athlete could do to a man who confused a gimmick with genuine menace. The takeaway is not really about Abyss. It is about what Steiner considered acceptable. He valued visible, measurable physical condition above all else. If your body did not look a certain way, your character meant nothing. Your skill meant nothing. Your history in the business meant nothing. You were weak. You were a fraud. And he was going to make sure everyone in the building knew it. Number 4, Christian Cage. Christian arrived in TNA after years in WWE, where he had been one of the most consistently entertaining performers on the roster. Creative, technically capable, genuinely charismatic, and hardworking. When he jumped to TNA, he was positioned as a main event star. Scott Steiner was not prepared to accept that without making his feelings known. To Steiner, Christian was a mid-card reject, a man who had tried and failed to reach the absolute top in WWE and had come to TNA looking for an easier path to a championship picture he had not earned through the right means. The assessment was blunt. Christian was weak. He did not have the muscle to stay at the highest level. He had come here thinking he could be a star, not on Steiner's watch. The philosophy behind this was about gatekeeping. Only Steiner had very specific ideas about who belonged at the top of professional wrestling. Size, physical dominance, the peaks, the capacity to handle a real fight. Christian was not a physically imposing man. He was gifted in other ways, but those other ways did not count in Steiner's system. Success built on personality and technical craft rather than raw physical superiority was not real success. It was the system rewarding the wrong things. The cruelty is significant. Christian had worked genuinely hard across his entire career. His improvement was real and visible. His move to TNA was a legitimate opportunity, and he made the most of it. Steiner's dismissal of that work was not measured criticism. It was the application of a rigid single standard that did not accommodate the many ways in which a wrestler can genuinely excel. Christian excelled. Steiner refused to recognize any of the qualities that made him excellent, and that refusal was delivered publicly because in Steiner's world, private disagreement was not sufficient. The room needed to hear it. Number 3, Shawn Michaels. Shawn Michaels is widely regarded as one of the greatest in-ring performers in wrestling history. His career is studied by performers who came after him. His matches are referenced as examples of storytelling executed at an extraordinary level. None of that mattered to Scott Steiner because Shawn Michaels was, in Steiner's taxonomy, a vanilla midget who had reached the top by playing politics. He was puny. He was protected by the Clique, the group of top WWE performers that included Michaels, Triple H, Diesel, Razor Ramon, and Sean Waltman, who wielded significant backstage power in the 1990s. The Clique shaped their own storylines. They influenced creative decisions. They protected each other at the expense of other people's opportunities. To Steiner, this was the definition of weakness. Not physical weakness, structural weakness. A man who needed friends in management to hold his spot was not a real athlete. He was a politician, a genetic freak stood alone, a weak man needed the Clique. And Shawn Michaels, in Steiner's assessment, was the clearest example of a performer who would not have survived without that political infrastructure keeping him in place. His view was simple. Put Shawn Michaels in a real ring with no script, no clique, no referee, and no protection. What happens? In Steiner's mind, the answer was obvious. A Division I All-American handles him. Everything Michaels achieved was built on political protection. Remove the protection, and there is nothing underneath to stand on. The irony is significant. Michaels Michaels returned from serious injury in 2002 and proceeded to deliver some of the most extraordinary performances in WWE history across the following years. His comeback career disproved almost everything Steiner's worldview would have predicted about him. But Scott Steiner does not revise his opinions based on what happens in the ring. The standard is the standard. Michaels was weak. That conclusion was made, and it was final. Number 2, Chris Jericho. Chris Jericho's career is one of the most remarkable stories in professional wrestling. He remained consistently relevant across multiple generations by reinventing himself over and over. He changed his character, his look, his style, and his approach every time the industry moved. Every time he should have become irrelevant, he found a way back. He is, by almost any honest assessment, one of the most talented performers the industry has ever produced. To Scott Steiner, he was another vanilla midget, another smaller man who succeeded in sports entertainment because the machine valued charisma and movesets over physical dominance. He said Jericho did not have the peaks, did not have the presence of a real heavyweight champion, did not have what it took in a genuine physical contest. He was weak. The numbers did not lie. The size obsession at the heart of this critique was consistent but brutal. Chris Jericho was not a small man by normal standards. When he was a solidly built professional athlete who trained seriously and was technically gifted across multiple disciplines, but measured against the standard of Scott Steiner's peaks, the biceps, the physique, the visible evidence of physical dominance, he fell short. And that shortfall in Steiner's mind canceled everything else on the list. The result was a complete dismissal of an entire career. All of Jericho's reinventions, all of his championship reigns, all of his genuinely innovative work across multiple companies and multiple decades. None of it registered as legitimate to Steiner because none of it was built on the foundation he required. Physical dominance first. Everything else was noise. Jericho's career is perhaps the strongest counter-argument to Steiner's entire worldview. It proves that adaptability, intelligence, and the ability to connect with an audience over a long period can sustain a career longer than raw, physical, imposing power. Steiner's standard would have predicted Jericho's irrelevance. Jericho's career has been an ongoing refutation of that prediction. But the standard does not change. It never changed. That was the point. Number 1, Hulk Hogan. And here we arrive at number 1. The man that Scott Steiner demonstrated the most sustained, deep, and genuinely felt contempt for across years of interviews, promos, public statements, and one very significant airport incident. Not because of a physique, not because of an inability to fight, but because of something Steiner considered a far more profound failure than either of those things. Hulk Hogan, in Scott Steiner's judgment, was a liar, a manipulator, a fraud who had spent an entire career building a myth around himself and using that myth to take from the people around him. His weakness was not in his body, it was in his character. And to Steiner, a man who is weak in his character is the weakest of all. Steiner's critique of Hogan was rooted in the idea that Hogan built his success not through athletic dominance, but through controlling the people above and below him. He called all the shots. He arranged outcomes. He used his fame as a currency to shape the industry around his own career at the direct expense of everyone else who needed that space to develop. That, to Steiner, was the purest kind of weakness. Not an inability to fight, an unwillingness to be honest about what you actually are. In 2009, Steiner reportedly went directly to TNA owner Dixie Carter and warned her. Well, he told her plainly that Hulk Hogan would run her company out of business, that Hogan would use TNA as a lazy payday without doing any real work to develop new stars. He described Hogan as someone with no genuine investment in the health or future of any company he joined. This was not a scripted promo. This was a real conversation Steiner felt obligated to have because he had watched Hogan operate for long enough to know exactly what was coming. The situation came to a head in 2015 at an airport. An encounter involving Hogan's wife led to Steiner making a comment about what he would do if he saw Hogan directly. Hogan took this as a terroristic threat and contacted the police. Steiner was eventually cleared by airport security footage. His reaction to Hogan calling the police was complete and total disdain, because to Steiner, calling the police was the final proof. A weak man hides behind authority. A weak man cannot face the genetic freak in person. He calls the law to do what he cannot do himself, and that was Hulk Hogan, a man wrapped in celebrity, hidden behind corporate structures and legal protection, unwilling and unable to face a direct challenge from anyone real. The weakest pick of them all. Not because his body failed him, because his honesty did. And for a man who built his entire standard around the idea that honesty was the only currency that mattered in professional wrestling, finding that kind of dishonesty at the very top of the industry was the deepest insult of all. Steiner could forgive a man for not having the right physique. He could not forgive a man for being a fraud. In his mind, there was no coming back from that. Hogan had made his choices across decades in front of the whole industry, and everyone had watched. That was the number one weakness. Not a body, a character, built on lies, protected by by fame and utterly unable to face what was real. Now let us talk about the cost, because the genetic freak standard came with consequences, and not all of them landed on the people Steiner targeted. The Ric Flair shoot promo in February 2000 came with a 2-week suspension. The company softened it by reportedly not docking his pay. They needed him too much to genuinely punish him, but the signal was there. Even a company as chaotic as late-era WCW had limits. Steiner had crossed one. He survived it. That would not always be the pattern. The Diamond Dallas Page situation was more serious than a suspension. What happened backstage in WCW in late 2000 was a physical assault. Steiner attacked a colleague in a way that could have caused permanent damage to his vision. The witnesses described him as out of control, as a genuine terror. This was not the controlled aggression of an amateur wrestler enforcing a principle. This was a man who had lost the ability to distinguish between a legitimate grievance and genuine violence. The threat to DDP's eyesight was real. The fact that it survived was fortunate rather than planned. Steiner's nails filed to points reportedly saved DDP's vision only by the narrowest margin. That is not discipline. That is an accident. The WWE run exposed cracks that Steiner had never publicly acknowledged. The Royal Rumble 2003 match was supposed to be the showcase of his WWE career. May the moment the world would finally see what Big Papa Pump could do against the best opponent the company had to offer. Instead, it became one of the worst title matches in Royal Rumble history. Steiner was dealing with drop foot syndrome. He gassed out. He performed over a dozen of the same suplex. The finish was a disqualification. He viewed this as sabotage. But there is a harder reading. A man whose entire philosophy was built on the supremacy of physical conditioning could not maintain his conditioning in an extended title match. The standard applied to the man who invented it revealed something inconvenient. Not that he was weak, but that his standard was narrower than he admitted. The Royal Rumble outcome did not change his worldview. Nothing ever did. And he moved to TNA and continued applying the same measuring stick to a new room. He delivered the Steiner math promo. He insulted Samoa Joe's physique using fake science. He attacked Christian, Abyss, and others with the same framework he had used since 1998. The cruelty was consistent. The standard was consistent. And the damage it did to the people around him was equally consistent. What the cost reveals about Steiner is that his philosophy was never really a tool for improving the industry. It was a tool for managing his own anger. When the machine did not organize itself around his values, he found ways to punish the people inside it. When someone succeeded in a way he did not respect, he made sure they heard about it. When someone confronted him, he used the physical tools his training had given him in ways those tools were never meant to be used. He demanded reality. He created chaos. And the chaos had a cost that was not always his to carry. In April 2022, Scott Steiner stood in a WWE Hall of Fame ceremony and accepted recognition that his career had been demanding for decades. And despite everything, the shoot promos, the suspensions, the backstage brawls, the DDP incident, the airport situation, the Steiner math promo, the Royal Rumble disaster, the endless list of colleagues he had called weak, fat, puny, fake, and senile, the industry came back and put him in the hall anyway. That is not a contradiction. It is the truth of what Scott Steiner was. The Steiner brothers were one of the greatest tag teams in wrestling history. Simply true. They changed what a tag team could look like. And they brought physicality and legitimacy to a format that was often built around choreography. Rick and Scott were dangerous together in a way that defined their era and influenced every serious tag team that followed them. Scott Steiner, as a singles performer, was a 3-time world champion who, in his prime, was arguably the most athletic heavyweight in the business. His innovations, the Frankensteiner, the screwdriver, the recliner, the SSD, remained part of the vocabulary of the sport. His amateur credentials were real. His physical ability was extraordinary. His willingness to say things on television that nobody else would say, true or not, fair or not, gave wrestling a texture of chaos and reality that the scripted product desperately needed at times. His meme legacy, built on the Steiner math promo, funny has kept him in cultural conversation long past his active era. Numbers don't lie is a phrase that people who have never watched a wrestling match can now recognize. That is a remarkable kind of cultural permanence. It says something about the force of his personality that even his most absurd moment became iconic. His nephew, Braun Breaker, entered the WWE carrying the same physical intensity and raw presence that defined the Steiner name in professional wrestling. The legacy continues. The standard, stripped of the cruelty, is still producing results. Scott Steiner was real. He was gifted. He was innovative. He was a genuine Hall of Famer who earned that recognition. He was also, for much of his career, genuinely unbearable to be around. Both of these things are true. Neither cancels the other. And that tension between the legitimate athlete and the destructive force is what makes him one of the most fascinating figures professional wrestling has ever produced. The numbers don't lie. And on Scott Steiner, they say, complicated, brilliant, and completely unforgettable.